Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Pocket Change, a podcast where I investigate injustices with an intersectional lens in niche pockets of our society to show how they reflect issues in America as a whole and how we can create change. In today's episode, I will be interviewing both current and former high school public forum debaters to investigate sexism in the high school debate community, focusing mostly on national circuit debate. Although sexism typically doesn't come to mind when one thinks of high school debate, the activity runs rampant with it. According to a 2019 study conducted by speech and debate director Rich Kowalix, female-identified debaters are criticized for being too assertive or aggressive about twice as frequently as male-identified debaters. He also finds that although the weekly participation of female-identified debaters in public forum nationwide averages about 42%, the qualification rate to the national tournament is nearly 10% lower. This lower level of qualification is due in part to women commonly being left out of prep groups, criticized for appearance more so than content, and being seen as too aggressive, which all fuels their scarily high dropout rate. With this background information in mind, I'm going to be asking some debaters questions regarding this sexism's intersectionality, its causes, and what actions to take. To start off, why don't you all introduce yourselves?
Sure. So I'm Annika. I'm a senior at Montgomery Blair in Rockville, Maryland. Sorry, I forgot where I live. No, I've debated since freshman year, and I'm really stoked to talk to you today. Yeah.
I'm Sophia. I go to school at UT Austin. I'm a first year business and liberal arts major there. And I did public forum debate for 7 years, 4 of which were with Yulin at Dallas High School in Houston. And yeah.
My name is Yulin. I'm also a freshman. I'm in econ right now at Texas A&M in College Station, Texas. I did debate with Sophia for 4 years. We traveled all around the country, and yeah, I don't know.
My name's Neil. I did debate for 4 years at Clements High School, mainly in the Houston area, but also a couple times nationally.
Okay, great. So the first question is pretty broad, so why don't some of you talk about your experience with being a woman in debate?
Totally. I think it's been very formative in a lot of ways. I think you go into debate not really realizing how much sexism kind of affects that entire space, and it's very implicit. So I think in a lot of ways it becomes super internalized, and like for me personally, I definitely didn't think my voice was strong enough or powerful enough. There was a lot of letting myself be talked over, but I think being in that space for several years, like being talked over both in round and out of round, and all that definitely makes you develop a different outlook on the value of your voice and your opinion. And I think it also led me to building more coalitions with friends and peers across the country, because there's definitely this shared solidarity that comes out of having those similar experiences for sure.
Yeah, that's really great that you're kind of looking at it from a positive angle, how you kind of realized that you could form relationships with others who kind of experience the same thing. So would you say that the majority of the sexism you faced in the debate sphere was being talked over and had to do with kind of in around things, or were there other elements to that?
I mean, I definitely think there's a lot of, dehumanization in round, when you run arguments that have to do with domestic violence or things that have to do with queer studies, stuff like that. There's a lot of reducing things down to statistics and forgetting that you're talking to actual people. So there is that. But I think also advice I got from team members or from coaches at some points about okay, prey on emotional vulnerability during crossfire. If you look like you're gonna cry, you're gonna get pity points from the judge. And so I think there was this level of people weren't trying to be overtly no, you're a woman, you're bad at debate. But there was this use your perceived weakness to your advantage kind of thing, which I personally found very sexist.
That's actually really interesting to me, because I've actually seen people kind of tell women to be less feminine in debate, so to speak with a lower voice. So the fact that you were kind of told to not embrace the femininity, but kind of play to different aspects of, traditional gender roles is actually kind of interesting. Yeah.
I think it is too. And I think also every judge has their own opinion on how you look and what you're wearing and what you're doing. One of my friends partners a different school got a comment once oh, you should cover up more. The other team was clearly distracted, and it was a female judge telling her to show less cleavage effectively, which was like kind of very messed up, of course. Like, what are you doing looking at that, right?
Right.
And I think, I've had judges tell me like to be less assertive, to be more aggressive, and it's like you're always trying to walk this middle line, but it's never enough, no matter which way you look at it.
Yeah. And it's also really difficult when it's like opposite sides of the spectrum. Like one judge wants like the exact opposite thing as the other. So it's like you can never fit into this like role, or like even if you wanted to become this like ideal female debater, there is none because it's so subjective. Whereas like for guys, I feel like it's very clear. It's just like, okay, just be like assertive, dominant, and then that kind of flies.
In middle school, I think like the sexism that we experienced is like probably a lot more blatant. Like we would like just get like really strange comments from like our debate coach about what we should wear and how we should present ourselves. And like we were told to like, be like authoritative, but not too authoritative. And like weirdly, we were told to like wear like more revealing clothing, even though we were like literally middle schoolers.
Wait, what?
Like I think like the biggest like through line through our debate experiences is like more so than us experiencing like blatantly sexist comments from our coach or from judges and stuff. We just felt like it was like really hard to find a community in debate because like even though we did have friends in middle school, it seemed like they were like more so trading prep with each other, and like they were hanging out more so with each other because they just like had more in common. And like I think like what made it difficult, especially for me, is just like always navigating like, is this like a thing because we're from a small school, or is this like just like a normal thing for people to experience when they're like transitioning from middle school to high school, or is this like a product of like being a woman in debate? Like I think it's just like really hard to navigate like what is a product of sexism and what is just like normal.
Right.
Yeah.
But
So like on the national circuit though, did you ever find like a group that you'd like share prep with and like talk with and hang out with at tournaments and things like that? Or
we definitely had more community than like a lot of the girls on the circuit, but for some reason it still felt like we were very lonely.
See, this is where it kind of gets confusing because like the Houston circuit was very supportive of us. And so as long as we weren't competing against them, they would send us prep. But it wasn't a thing where like we would trade prep with each other. It was more of like oh, you're going to a tournament I'm not going to, and this topic is over. So here's some prep, right? It was like I don't know what how to describe it. It was kind of like charity. It felt like charity. These are people we had co-championed with. These are people we competed and beat. And like it never got to that point where we were just like, oh, we're probably equals. Like that never happened.
I have become very aware of the fact that I was so affected by imposter syndrome, like all through, like every time we would get a bid or whatever, like win a tournament, like I would inherently feel like, first of all, I would feel like, oh, did we deserve it? Because a lot of the time there's lots of conversations about why we didn't deserve our success from our so-called friends on the circuit, but that's another story. But so I would feel like did we deserve it? And also like, oh, like if we debate like a team that I consider good, they're gonna realize that like, oh, we like didn't earn our bids, or like we're not as good as our record indicates that we are. Again, I don't know if that's like a function of, I don't know, debate just being a very competitive activity and me just being a very competitive person, or if that's a function of like being a woman in debate.
But yeah, I think it's being a woman in debate. Like people would tell us our success wasn't ours. Like people would come up to us and say, like not come up to us, but we'd hear behind our backs like, oh, if they had debated this team, they would not have been there. Like it was just like these like unnecessary, like their bids are illegit. Like these are things that people would say to us, and people like that we were friends with and we had known for a while. And so it always felt like we were on the outside. There was this one round at in finals, and we were like the only girls in the room. 3 judges were male. The whole audience was male. They were all guys we knew, but it was only male. We were debating 2 guys. Like standing there was so nerve-wracking. And I finally like looked around the room and I was like, I don't see myself here. And I was like, it's just me. Like it's what the heck? Like it's just us. And I don't know. And then it felt like, and then at state, or just like at any other tournament, like it just felt like if we had lost, it would mean that like girls can't get to this point, or like it would just mean like, oh, like they proved us right? Like we couldn't do it. Gender made a difference. Like
I feel like it's ridiculous that like because you were the only like girl team, that it felt like all the pressure was on your shoulders to prove like you were representing all girls. Like almost that just seems like an undue burden, but like the way that the numbers broke down makes it seem that way, and that's like so difficult. The next question is kind of about intersectionality. So it is important to have an intersectional approach looking at issues like sexism. So looking at like not only gender, but how it overlaps with race, class, sexuality, and more. So in what ways do you think we could look at sexism in debate with that type of mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't think we were like particularly restricted by the color of our skin or like how much money our parents had, because I don't know. I think we're just like privileged in that way.
It was really weird. The judge was like a Black man. He was telling like one of our opponents was also a Black man. He was like, oh, you don't need to be so aggressive. And they're like nice, sweet girls. But we weren't being nice, sweet girls in that round. Like we were being pretty aggressive. So it was just like weird to see that, because I didn't see them as aggressive, and it did not come off that way. But yeah, maybe I think we might have had more privilege in that we were able to be more aggressive and not get the, like, maybe not as aggressive as white men, but like we were able to be more aggressive than Black men or Black women in the activity.
Yeah, I definitely agree that like even though, you know, you may be like oppressed or like not as privileged in one aspect, it's important to kind of analyze yourself and see like what other levels of privilege that you are standing on that you can't really see. And I think even aside of like race, there's like probably a lot of discrimination going on with like sexuality. And I think there are some people who spoke out about being like transgender in debate and being like called like slurs and things like that. So yeah, I think there should be more attention directed in those areas, perhaps.
We talk about the Houston circuit being like very toxic toward women, but like we don't have any conversations about the fact that literally everyone on our circuit who's like very prominent is either like a white straight boy or like an Asian like Fort Bend County like debater. Like like I don't know. I think like the community is definitely having like a big reckoning with like gender in debate, but I feel like the same amount of attention hasn't been applied to like race in debate. Probably just like I feel like that's probably a product of the fact that there aren't like enough like prominent like Black and brown debaters who, yeah, just like period.
I definitely think intersectionality in debate, from my point of view, is an undercovered field of debate for context. I definitely believe that, for example, the LGBTQ community, people of color, especially women of color, are more excluded from groups that tend to address these issues. A strong way in which I think we can address intersectionality is dividing the current groups that we have now. For example, the main nonprofits that exist in the debate sphere towards advancing equality, and even the overarching organization, the National Speech and Debate Association, which does not do its best to rectify inequalities in debate, definitely are too widely spread in their attempts to try and achieve intersectionality. So for example, organizations that try to achieve equality tend to only focus on upper class white women when they target things like sexism in debate. The same goes for the NSDA, which also tends to target schools that have a lot more money, give the pulpits to schools that tend to be more privileged. And as a result, people who want intersectional approaches to debate are often left out of the conversation. I believe that if we were to break down these organizations to be more specific towards each group that needs it and to address each marginalized community's needs individually, rather than acting as one big blanket, the debate community would be a lot more effective in addressing the issue of intersectionality in debate.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
I think it's very internal. So I feel like even within like women in debate, I would say women in most like activist spaces or like most communities anyway, there's a lot of like oppression Olympics that gets played, if you know what I mean. Like, no, like people will devalue or like mitigate the struggles that some individual faces on the basis of like, no, like I'm a woman too and I don't experience that. Or like I'm a girl on your team and I've never had these people talk over me. Like it's all in your head. And I think there's so much gaslighting that happens like from women towards other women, especially in the debate community. Like I don't know. It's very strange because I think like I've done this before. I know other people have done this to me before, and it's not like intentional, but I think a lot of people try to minimize trauma to make themselves feel more comfortable and secure and stable in communities with other men dominating teams. And I think when you think about intersectionality, you have to realize that everyone has their own set of experiences shaped by a conglomerate of different factors that build their identity. So my experience in debate is going to be different from someone who experiences like more classism. Like I benefit from class privilege. I benefit from racial privilege too. And I think it's important that we all do like that internal like, critical analysis to understand what we benefit from in the debate space. I benefit from like speaking English as my first language too, right? And that's a huge asset in so many debate tournaments. And I just think a lot of women, especially white women, will try and like make their experiences and like those are the only ones worth hearing when you talk about bigotry in debate communities.
Absolutely, that's so true. Like the idea of kind of delegitimizing or invalidating other people's experiences because you don't realize how much privilege you have. So I think that's definitely a really great point. So, what are some communities, I guess, within the debate sphere that you think are more marginalized and kind of like overlap with each other to make them kind of have like a worse experience or a more difficult experience?
I mean, I think the experience that trans women face in debate is very different from what like a cisgender woman like myself will face, right?
Mm,
And I think there is so much, I mean, not so much, but there's a lot more advocacy done within the debate space for like cis women and women's issues. But we don't really think about like our non-binary peers as often as we should. Like if you think
absolutely.
about the research that's been done in the past by Beyond Resolve and other organizations as well, it's mostly about like female and male representing debaters. We don't think about androgyny as much
Mhm,
as we should. And I
mhm.
think that's a group that is so overlooked and we need to be better about that.
That's so true. So speaking of which, like, how do you think that Beyond Resolved could like improve with that? For reference, Beyond Resolved is a student-run nonprofit organization that primarily focuses on fighting sexism in debate.
This is one of my favorite topics. Oh my gosh. So I'm vice president for Beyond Resolve this
Mhm,
year. And this year we instated a thing called initiatives to address that specifically. So these are kind of like affinity groups that work with wealth and class as one, race as another, LGBTQ plus initiatives as like another. And
mhm,
our fourth one is about mental health and disabilities. And so these are all like trying to make Beyond Resolve less of a white hetero cis women's program and more
mhm.
about looking at how like marginalization and oppression affect people in all communities like throughout the debate space. I think we definitely can be better about like incentivizing and increasing overlap between these communities because you can definitely be part of more groups than just one. And like I think almost all of us are like we are not all, like one of these things. So I think we definitely want to going forward, try to find ways to make this more collaborative.
Wow, that's like really incredible. That's
Thanks.
yeah, that's so great that you have all those programs. It's perfect. So I guess the next question that I have is kind of an interesting one. So do you think that having a separate category for just female debaters would be empowering or disempowering?
I think this is one that's very personal for a lot of people. I personally would find it disempowering. I feel like it conflates the idea that female debaters can only like be successful within their own strata or their own group.
Mm,
And I think it's also to some extent cisnormative, right? Like if you have a male bracket and a female bracket, what about like an NB bracket, And
exactly.
like at that point, I just feel like it doesn't address the nuance of gender being more of a spectrum than a binary.
Mm,
Which is why I personally am not super supportive of having that be its own like NSDA endorsed bracket. But I definitely know from like other female debaters that events like all female tournaments have been really like supportive and helpful for them. So I'm definitely in favor of those happening as and when people want to plan them, and I would support those like being developed or whatever. But I don't think there should be like its own separate bracket necessarily. I don't know.
yeah. I also think that creating these different brackets or categories can be a very slippery slope because it's like, okay, then if you're going to make a separate category for female debaters, then should we do one for like people of color or should we do one for like non, or like queer debaters? Like there are like almost infinite categories and each time you make one, you're kind of otherizing this group, which also serves to kind of isolate communities instead of like embracing people who really do well within like the collective organization and then celebrating it then.
I think if it's like a whole category for just women, you run into the issue of just like women have to be in a different category because they're not good enough.
I think that like all women are like I don't know, like all black or whatever, like round robins are like a good idea. So I feel like more so than just like establishing like all women tournaments, maybe just like trying to establish like all women prep groups or like, you know, like group chats and like other things like kind of foster a sense of community so that even when you are like alone, you don't feel like you're unsupported.
I think the best way in which we can implement an only female debate style is by developing the current middle ground that we have. For example, encouraging more all-female or more all LGBTQ tournaments in which these people can find a safe space, and then encouraging the transition to a more inclusive debate space.
Looking outside of having different tournaments or all-female tournaments, what do you think of integrating it into having like a top female speaker award and just having different categories of awards for women?
I think that sort of thought process is infinitely regressive. For example, then we'd be leaving every single LGBTQ person out of the community. For example, I think we'd still run into the same problems with intersectionality because who would be winning those speaker awards? It would probably be privileged white women, in all honesty. So even if we did end up creating a separate speaker award for certain groups, it would again still exclude other groups. And we would continue to fall into this cycle of virtue signaling. We'd be like, okay, we did this one thing to help females feel empowered, but now it's only a certain group of females feeling empowered. And as a result, I think it would like sort of stagnate our ability to actually reform the activity at its core.
Yeah, if you're like willing to register your gender, I feel like it'd be a good idea. Like, I feel like Yulin has been top female speaker so many times, and it probably would have felt nice to have like an award to show for it. My one reservation is like, I guess it kind of feels like there's like a qualification, like you're like the top like female speaker, not like the top speaker or whatever.
Right.
The reform should be in like, I think like maybe I don't know. I think it's a band-aid fix. I don't think it'll fix the deeper problem. I think like if we fix the deeper problems, then we don't need the fix. But maybe it would like feel nice, I think.
Moving kind of into this topic of toxic masculinity, as you know, it involves men being boxed into like traditional male gender roles. And I was just wondering like where in debate you see this play out.
I think kind of like what I was talking about earlier with crossfire, like women are usually told to like, either be more aggressive, be less aggressive, like, I don't know, whatever, right? On the other hand, men are supposed to be more assertive, don't show emotion, like put them in their place, show them who's boss, which I think is definitely like bordering on toxic masculinity. And I think also a lot of men will go out of their way to make their opponents feel bad as a way of asserting their dominance within a round. Perceptual dominance type beat, like hooray, but not a good thing. Don't endorse that.
Yeah, I definitely see that like playing out, especially through like interrupting in Crossfire, like not only just like talking louder and sounding more confident, but actively like preventing other people from speaking because they think their voice is the only one that really matters in that space. And I also think that a lot of the comments that are made can be like very disparaging. For example, like I think in one of my crossfires, I was asked like, do you even know how economics works? Like, do you know how to do research? Like, I think that that's kind of bordering on like ad hominem attacks that they think are shows of confidence, but are actually just straight up like rude.
I think toxic masculinity is a very, very common and very accepted trait that we put into debate. For example, I think the comments that we receive as debaters in terms of feedback often gravitate towards entrenching the form of toxic masculinity that is already very common in society. An example of this would be, as a male, I think I for sure received on the ballot, like, you need to be more aggressive, or you need to assert yourself more, or you need to be louder. And Crossfire, me being a generally quiet person when I ask questions. So I definitely think that is a form of toxic masculinity because we're encouraging males, but not females, to assert themselves in the room. And at the same time, we are telling people to change their personalities, change the how deep their voice is, changed how they speak in general, just to fit what we see as a male and what a traditional male we think should be.
One aspect of toxic masculinity is this idea of like boys will be boys. Like, where do you see that play out as well?
I mean, I think, I don't know, I'll try to word this like as best as I can, but I think the brand of sexism that exists in debate is very distinct in that like it's super subconscious. Like I think most people in debate would call themselves woke and left leaning, like for the most part. But that perpetuates so much complacency where like if I tell a male opponent that he was mansplaining to me in like a practice round, right? He'll be like, no, I was just telling you something. Like it's not my fault. Stop being so sensitive, which is like literally the point of trying to get someone to understand that. Because I think there's this idea that like I'm smart, I research, I'm woke, I can't be wrong, which I think is literally what mansplaining reinforces through. I don't know. It's like a very messy, like negative feedback loop, I would say. And I think that's kind of where boys will be boys kind of comes into play as well, because it's like, no, it's the girls who are being sensitive. It's not my fault. It's theirs. which manifests so much more when you think like, oh, I have like a sister, I have like female teammates, I can't be sexist in like the debate space.
Right. It's like this sense of like almost entitlement where it's like they've cultivated this kind of identity of being like a very like progressive person. So they think that they can't make mistakes. So like
Yes.
kind of being closed-minded about that. Yeah, I definitely see that phenomenon play out. That makes a lot of sense.
I think in the actual debate sphere itself in round, we often justify, for example, guys yelling or guys talking over other people or guys using like hateful language in round just by saying boys will be boys. And I think that is justified by saying, oh, guys are always going to be more aggressive or more loud. And we just justify that kind of hurtful language and that sort of like system in which males like sort of explain excessively towards women just because of this like superiority complex that most of us don't acknowledge that we have. Secondly, obviously, debate has a big sexual assault problem. And while that is a whole other issue, I definitely think that the boys will be boys idea is very often used in order to justify that as well.
Absolutely. And even on the more micro scale, like I think even when men make disparaging comments about women or objectifying comments, they're also kind of just told that boys will be boys. Okay, going into more of like a general question, like what do you think are some of the largest factors that contribute to like sexism in the debate sphere? So I hesitate to say like root cause because I don't think there's one sole cause, but what are some of the like largest factors, do you think?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I think a big part of how we see sexism in debate uniquely also is when we think about impacts and cards, right?
Mm-hmm.
We think of them as very abstract and removed from us because we're trained to do that. Like we're trained to find a really good impact card, be like, oh my gosh, this is fire. I found a perfect card. We don't do the analysis to think about what that actually means for people.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you get a card that says 40 million people are going to starve in Venezuela, you text your team chat, you say, oh my gosh, look at this evidence. You don't think about what that means for 40 million people in Venezuela.
Like you don't feel bad for them. You're like, oh, this is good for me. So you're like actually happy about this, even though you're just like profiting off of someone else's like suffering.
Exactly. There's so much commodifying trauma that happens in and out of round.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Like, especially when we end up like debating topics like Yemen, but then, you know, maybe not donating to the war efforts, you know, or like not to the war efforts, but like to like relief efforts.
Right.
Even though we're like abundantly aware of the famine that's going on or like how many people are dying, like we know those numbers, but then we don't do anything about it because we're trained to only see it in context of like winning or losing and not as like actual human beings. I think that's a really excellent point.
I think like during the Venezuela topic, I saw like these Reddit posts about like it would be a shame if Maduro got out of office, excuse me, before my next tournament because then my neg case is obsolete. I'm like, is that really your priority here? Like there's a whole human crisis going on in South America in this country, and you just like care about your tournament this weekend. Okay.
When males start in debate as a whole, it is often equal. Like the distribution of males and females is often equal very early on. And what you see is that over time, girls tend to drop out at a much higher rate than guys. And as girls come to their senior year, it is often that they are left alone. And this is because of factors like sexist comments that people receive. This is because of a lack of judge training, and people don't make fair and equitable decisions and end up making very sexist comments. So I think this becomes a self-defeating cycle where young girls who enter debate experience all these factors, and a combination of having few role models to look up to in debate is a huge reason as to why many girls tend to end up dropping out instead of staying in.
Yeah, okay. I think like these like big like camp institutions that we give so much weight to need to have like third-party audits or like, and also like they need to just like explicitly hire people who are like on board and their job is to like promote like diversity and inclusion. Because like obviously this is like such a growing problem, or not a growing problem, but like it's like becoming more and more prominent in debate. And like, for example, like expecting like first year outs to be like spearheading the conversations about like inclusion in debate, like we don't know anything either. Okay, like we literally only know like what we experience. So it's like not, it shouldn't be like the onus on us to like be like guiding these like young impressionable debaters and like how they're supposed to be perceiving like race and sexism in debate.
I think leadership at NSDA is another thing. I have no idea who they are. There's accountability for them, right? Like these are people who are making decisions, and like these are people who could be doing oversight, but there's no accountability for them. I have no idea who they are. I don't know like why they don't do more, right? Like thing that happened at whatever tournament that was in California about that list of like girls. Heard of that? A list of ranking girls on the circuit.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, like that thing, like did that get properly handled? How do we know that got properly handled, right? Like there's nowhere to file these claims to, like I got, like they're like people we can like the Wallace thing, like that had to come out through Twitter. Like there should be a proper channel for you to be like, hey NSDA, you should investigate my school or this school and you should talk to them about this problem. Like there's no proper channel for that, and there could be, like it could very easily be a proper channel for me to like submit an anonymous tip and be like, hey, I think you should check into this, but there isn't.
I think even on the local level, that's really struggling because I think there are a lot of people who at tournaments report something to Tab and then Tab does nothing, or they're like, oh, this judge is problematic, and then they hire the judge again. And like, especially when they are judges with clout or like first year out judges, because somehow there's still like collusion within Tab room. So I think that on like every level, there is like not enough accountability. The next question is, what role can and should men play in combating sexism?
I feel like this is a much like broader big picture question, and I think a lot of it goes back to like that process of internal accountability. And I think it's not just men, I think it's women and NB people and just all people as well who have to take these steps, because women can propagate systems of like oppression and sexism too. People of color can propagate racism by like perpetuating jokes that are racist in nature or whatever. And I think it's important for us to A, stop playing the oppression game, B, stop gaslighting and like listen to experiences. And I think C, just be more receptive to like steps to change. I think people are really quick to demonize or click the unresolved for trying without proposing their own alternative solutions. And I think it's really important to not think of this as someone else's issue, but as all of our issue to solve.
Yeah, definitely not making the burden rest on any group, but kind of taking like this coalitional approach that we were talking about earlier is definitely very important.
What also help is just like, you know, like men have had a lot of success on the circuit, like they should be like actively reaching out to mentor like young girls and like underrepresented and underserved communities, even if like your main friends or whatever, like the people that you thought were the best in the circuit, the people who like have the most potential or like have had the most success are like the boys that you knew. Like I think there's a lot of value in just like reaching out to like people who probably haven't had the opportunity as much to like achieve those same levels of success and like trying to mentor them as well.
So as we were talking about earlier, there are some groups that tend to distance themselves from the issue of sexism. So how can organizations like Beyond Resolved or like just you as an individual reach those people better and spread these messages better?
I think a lot of leftists and progressives especially have this like holier than thou attitude where it's like, no, I'm right. I read so much theory. I know what I'm talking about. You don't, right? And I think it can often lead to like white people with class privilege telling like people of color from lower income backgrounds what their experiences are and what policies would benefit their communities, and talking over lived experience and anecdotal evidence, which I think is really, really messed up. So I think it's important for us to all take a step back and analyze our limited perspective, because we all have that in some way. And if we see others talking where they shouldn't be or being rude or like diminutive, we should speak up and be like, hey, like that's not.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really great point with in terms of talking about like kind of talking over different populations because you're kind of resting on this moral high ground. I think one of the issues could also be, as we were talking about, with like someone who, you know, reads a lot of theory and academic writing, that maybe it can become a little bit jargonistic sometimes. And so the writing is inaccessible to people. So maybe sometimes like finding ways to make these messages like genuinely informative to people instead of also serving the ulterior motive of showing how educated you are.
So while I definitely don't think that it should be like someone's role to tell men like you are being sexist, unfortunately, that is just something that has to happen because unfortunately not everyone is able to come to the conclusion on their own that they are like being sexist. I think that female-led organizations have a huge role to play in reaching out to men effectively and making sure that they are implementing systems in which men are able to change their minds. I think the biggest thing that they can do in order to fix this is eliminating this moral hierarchy that many organizations carry in context to males. While males have done bad things in debate, and while males probably are perpetuating sexist systems, in order to reach out to the males who are doing bad things, it's important to do things like eliminating jargon that we use in order to discuss these topics. And it's important to do things to tell males, like, even if you are not bad, there are bad things going on in the debate sphere, and you should still actively take steps to stop this. So changing the style of messaging, and which is currently pushed in debate, is very, very important, I think, because I think, at least from a male point of view, I think a lot of other guys perceive it as like, and as bad as it is, it's an unfortunate truth that a lot of guys perceive it as we are being told what to do by girls. And while this is an inherent part of like the patriarchal society, I think that altering the messaging a little bit is a good first step in finding a middle ground with these guys, instead of starting to from the point of jargon and getting nothing done to begin with.
So, in what way can the messaging be changed to get rid of the guys are being told what to do by girls? Because inherently, that's what the premise of the question is.
Sure. So I think instead of saying, like, for example, one nonprofit has this thing called the Hall of Shame, where people are allowed to speak out about their experiences. And I think that's very, very important. But I think a lot of guys view it as like maybe they feel like they're being demonized as a gender as a whole, even when it's just certain guys who are doing bad. So I think instead of doing things like that, but running initiatives that try to make debate more equitable, for example, encouraging males to portray themselves in a positive light instead of portraying males in a negative light on your own accord, would probably be a good step in helping those kinds of people like acknowledge that there are things that have been done badly.
So, as a whole, then, do you think that the debate space has made progress in combating sexism?
Taboo is becoming more receptive to offering things like judge writing, which I think is super important. And I think as more pockets are like developing or whatever, they're developing with a more equitable lens in mind from the get-go. And I think it's easier to like teach properly at the beginning than to unlearn later on in life. So I think, yes, it's getting better from the ground up, but I think change takes time and it's never going to be perfect and we have to keep fighting throughout.
Absolutely. So, I guess, like, where we are today, what interventions do you think are the most critical to be making right now?
Well, right now with debate being online for the most part, I think we have to be even more conscious of like not talking over people because Zoom is really, really bad at, like body language and stuff too. I think being online is good for like access and stuff because it's easier to like log into a computer than to like fly 100 miles or whatever. But I think they still charge insane fees. And I think reducing that cost is really important to improve access overall from like that more like intersectional approach that we were talking about earlier.
Sure. So like I mentioned before, I definitely think there should be a ton of more intervention in the debate space as a whole. For example, groups that operate on a blanket level of just equity should be broken up into different types of inequities that exist in debate, including like class issues, rural to urban issues, sexism issues, LGBTQ issues, race issues, etc. I also think that the central organization of debate, which is the National Speech and Debate Association, should be playing a much bigger role in sexism debate. For example, currently they only release flyers on how to be equitable in debate, but that's simply not enough in order to encourage equity in debate, because anyone can skim through a flyer and answer a few questions, but that's not going to all of a sudden change the way in which they've operated their entire life. On the other hand, I think if the debate association were to come in and tell judges to actually give reasons as to why they voted one way or another, have more enforcement over, for example, the amount of like attentiveness that judges have in round, especially both parent and like experienced judges, I think it would be a very effective way in which we can encourage people to actually use logical reasoning and not like implicit biases.
And then lastly, so looking at the real world, how do we see the same sexism that is within debate play out in like society as a whole?
During one of the presidential debates for like the Democratic primary, like they were all asked what they would say to their other like opponents if they could, or like what gift they would give to them. Said something about like, oh, like I would give them my book, I would give them blah blah blah, this material possession type of thing. And Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar both said I would like apologize to all of them for like ever coming off too harsh or rude or like antagonistic, which I think was super powerful because the two women on that debate stage apologized for being assertive effectively. Which I just found to be super like reflective of how in rounds as high schoolers we're trained to like kind of be more submissive and complacent.
Yeah.
While men are taught to be aggressive and like go at it, you know?
I think that the same sexism debate directly translates to our legislative systems. For example, there was a very famous news story that broke out about a Congress representative named Ted Yoho, who verbally assaulted Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the steps of the House of Representatives in a sexist manner. This is a very common, and this is not one example, but is a very common example of how, because there are less female members in our legislative bodies, they are looked down upon in terms of their ability to policy make, their ability to speak out. And the issues that they bring up are often regarded as much less important by males. So I think that is one very clear way in which the sexism that we see in debate, like talking down, having bad like discussions, etc., is a way in which it's manifests. At the same time, I think the way in which we debate also has directly translated to a bad system of legislation. For example, men who decide what they want to do with women's bodies in terms of legislation, men who decide that they should be able to limit funding for things like domestic abuse in exchange for other things based on their own decision making rather than, for example, anecdotals or statistics, is a perfect example of how sexism has manifested into the real world and the politics sphere. So I think that sexism, again, in debate is a microcosm of the real world, and it is definitely a direct consequence of the real world.
Yeah, I definitely see how politics is a very direct way to compare the two. Do you see any of this play out outside of the realm of politics?
Sure, yeah. I think another example of this would be the workforce, right? For example, female managers are often disobeyed a lot more. Female managers are ignored a lot more. And when we look to, for example, the women and men pay gap, we directly see how women are often paid less for doing the same exact job and valued a lot less for doing the same exact job as males. So I definitely think there is a direct correlation between the sexism we see of people who are in debate and the same like sort of mentality that we see in schools playing out in the workforce.
And there's also like a little workforce within debate, in which there's like coaching and working at camps and things like that. And we also see that manifest with like people being less willing to find like female coaches, or coaches being less willing to coach like female teams and things like that. So that is definitely also a great like comparison to be drawn.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Today, we touched on the issues of oppression Olympics, intersectionality, elitism, imposter syndrome, and much more. After hearing all of their responses, it's clear to me that although we can all agree that sexism exists in debate, it manifests itself differently for everyone. For some women, they're told to emulate a man, and for some, they're told to capitalize on their femininity. Some think having gender categories may be empowering, and others don't. But we can all undeniably see that the struggles of being a woman in debate are only exacerbated by issues of race, class, sexuality, and more. And there are many more interventions that need to be made in the space. And it's clear, the debate space is a microcosm for society as a whole, with powerful women in politics still apologizing for being too aggressive, and female bosses being taken less seriously in the workplace. So it's critical that we make interventions where we can, no matter how small. So, for those connected to debate, and even for those who aren't, support organizations like Beyond Resolved that aim to ameliorate sexism in the space. Reach out to NSDA and local tournaments to demand more accountability and enforcement of equity procedures. And to everyone, hold yourself accountable. Regardless of if you are or aren't in debate, be aware of how you may be contributing to the issue. Stop mansplaining. Lift up female voices in discussions. Check yourself for internalized misogyny. Don't make or laugh at sexist jokes. And most importantly, be kind. This is Pocket Change, and thanks for listening.